Filmed on location at our beautiful Old Westbury 604-acre campus, we offer a variety of majors to choose from and a wonderful opportunity to discover the leader in you. Please visit us at oldwestbury.edu. When can you start?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another program in our series, Living on Long Island. Today we will focus on the rich history of Long Island, filled with the names and events of long ago, but also how it relates to today. I am so happy to have two people who could help me learn more and make my audience learn more also. My two guests are Nicole Menchise. Did I get that right?
It's Menchise.
Menchise. Well,
close enough.
Okay, thank you. And you are an archivist and a collections manager at the Oyster Bay Historical Society.
That's correct.
And also at the Raynham Hall Museum.
That's right.
Very impressive.
Thank you.
Okay. And Robert Harrison, historian, photographer from East Meadow, and you're a native Long Islander.
That's correct, Joe.
Great.
You can call me Bob if you like.
Today I will. Okay, thank you. Bob and Nicole, welcome.
Thank you.
In history, usually, I think the best way to do things is chronologically. So let's start with early Long Island during the American Revolution. Feel free to...
Okay, the American Revolution was very interesting, but I'd like to just say an opening statement that
Sure.
Long Island has always been a very political state of being. Always in the politics of Long Island, it starts from the very first. As you know, the Dutch were from the West End, and the English were from the Hamptons and the North Fork End, plus Huntington, and I guess Oyster Bay was what?
It was actually right in the middle. It's actually sort of considered an international border area.
Fantastic. So anyway, it's always been a political being. The first New York State poet was Jacob Steendam, a little known fact. And his first poetry was about Long Island. He lived in Flushing.
Wow.
And it was all about the beautiful fishes, the vegetables, the foods that can be had here to draw people to come here. So it's been, and he was hired by the Hudson Bay, so he had a political motive for getting people here population-wise. As you know, Peter Stuyvesant was the last governor for the Dutch, I believe it was. So we go jumping into the American Revolution, and the biggest battle in North America at that time was the Battle of Long Island.
Now, let's get our audience straight. What years was that?
Talking, well, Declaration of Independence, 1776.
Right. And that's when the Battle of Long Island was?
That's when it happened. Before that, you had the Concord, you had the bridge, you had the takeover of Boston, and the British had to leave Boston because they were defended so fantastically by the Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New England troops. It lasted a good couple of weeks, and it wasn't fruitful for the British to stay in Boston, so they decided to take New York.
Wow, okay.
And Congress said to Washington, our commander-in-chief, defend New York. It wasn't like Boston. It wasn't. It was too long, too big, too geographically large to be a defense with militia, with people, farmers that came with their own guns. Bayonets were actually the huge weapon at the time. Guns were secondary. I didn't know that.
Now, how long did this last?
Only about 2.5 days.
Now, where was it exactly?
Okay, mainly in Brooklyn,
Okay.
Brooklyn Heights, the Guanas around there, and Jamaica. And what happened was the British fleet came in to Staten Island and based himself there. Washington thought he was going to defend. Also, he had Manhattan to defend, which is only a small village in the bottom of Manhattan, but to defend whole Brooklyn and Queens. Think about that.
Wow.
It was very rural, but what happened? It happened in August 27th and 28th of 1776.
So did any battles actually occur in what is present-day Long Island? Did it ever get this far east?
No,
No,
it
not as far
maintained. There was a couple of incidents I want to mention later.
Sure.
But in Long Island, I'll briefly make it that the British had 32,000 troops, 140 ships.
Wow.
And George Washington had about 9,000 volunteers, militia, and really no ships at all against the British. And the British were led by Cornwallis and Clinton. And
Not President Clinton.
No. We had a Governor Clinton too,
Yes,
I
we
guess.
did.
True.
Yeah. But anyway, the battle lasted only about a day and a half, where the British came behind our troops and captured most of Brooklyn and most of Queens at that time. So Washington, in his biggest defeat, actually saved the day. On the second day, rain made it unreliable to fight. But also, he called all the ships over from Manhattan and transported his ships all that night in the fog back to Manhattan and escaped the British wrath the next day. So therefore, he saved our troops and he lost our troops. But it was a large battle that had 2 Long Islanders involved into it, not to
I was
take too
going
much
to
time.
ask that. Were they famous Long Islanders?
Yes, 2 of them. A guy named General Nathaniel Woodhull. All right, he was from Mastic, I believe, and he led our Suffolk and Queens troops in the battle, 250 of them. All right. Don't forget there was no Nassau County at that time. That was
Oh, that was
Oh,
going to
so
ask you.
Queens County.
There was a Suffolk County and not a Nassau County?
right. Nassau was Queens actually.
Right,
Oh,
it was all
okay.
Queens
Yeah,
County.
yeah. And became in about 1899, you can correct me, around there we became Nassau County, due to the farmers, by the way, who didn't want to pay the taxes to the city.
Oh, okay.
So that's always been a political thing.
Okay.
So anyway, I'll briefly mention Nathaniel Woodhull, who didn't get the word from Washington to retreat and was captured by the British, and he died the next day in captivity.
Oh,
And the other one was Benjamin Talmadge. Is it Talmadge?
Talmadge.
Okay, very interesting man. He was a college classmate of Nathaniel Hale. All right?
Nathan Hale.
Nathan Hale.
Nathan Hale, right.
And his house site out in Huntington, where is a plaque to him where he landed and was transferring spy missions
Wow,
for Washington. But he was a classmate. So in those days, don't forget, everybody more or less knew each other,
Yes.
especially if they were in the upper classes. Well, he fought the battle. He lived to fight another day. But he was more famous in 1780, 4 years later. The Tories and the Whigs, the Tories captured Long Island and New York for the duration of the war. We were under English rule. But Talmadge went to Connecticut. He came back with a force of 200 men, marched across Long Island and burnt Manor St. George, which was a British fort in Mastic. And on the way back, he went to Quorum and burned 300 tons of hay,
Wow.
which supplied the British. Now, what's interesting about this, Washington was appreciative of that because that cut the British supplies off on Long Island. But the fact is, in 1983, the Boy Scouts, as an Eagle project, actually recreated the trail. It's called the Talmadge Trail. And it goes from the North Shore all the way down the Mastic, 21 miles. And you can walk it yourself if you like.
That's interesting.
I was going to ask you that. In present-day Long Island, are there places, plaques, signs, something where these things can be seen? Because sometimes local government, in all due respect, doesn't do a good enough job at promoting these things.
Right.
And maybe people who would be interested, how would they know?
Well, there's landmarks all over, national, state landmarks, federal landmarks. So there is signage for these places, and you conveniently now can go online and start to kind of dot or plan your own trip around that. So some people feel like those signs are a little bit of a clutter, but and sometimes the information isn't exactly correct. But for the most part, especially in, it was 1976, I believe, with our bicentennial that instigated a number of signage ideas to
Well,
go
they
up
should-
all
they should
over
do
Long
more of
Island.
it.
Yes,
I mean, we can't be Colonial Williamsburg, but we could do a little better job.
right.
Oyster Bay has a lot of the examples because that was a British headquarters, correct?
Right. The British did occupy Oyster Bay and several other villages on Long Island, throughout the war. Which actually you mentioned Talmadge, and of course that brings to mind the Culper Spy Ring, which is actually getting a lot of interest again.
Explain to our audience what exactly that was.
Well, the Culper Spy Ring was developed by George Washington. He gathered Talmadge and asked Talmadge to sort of give some recommendations as to people that he felt were patriots, true patriots, and were also capable of being discreet. And essentially, Talmadge and Washington developed the spy ring, whereby beginning in you know, not, like you said, New York City was very, very small and at the southern tip of Manhattan at the time. So Robert Townsend, who we now know as Culper Jr. in the spy ring, transferred his information about what he learned listening, spying on the British, transferred that information to a gentleman named Austin Rowe, who then gave that to Abe Woodhull, whose actual story right now is being portrayed on AMC. They have a television show called Turn about this exact human being and all the spy ring and everything that transpired. And then Caleb Brewster sailed across the Sound and then reconnected with Talmadge, who had then in turn sent that back over to George Washington, all the information. So it is sort of a bit of a circle, and so it's called the spy ring. And from what we understand now, looking back all these years, that's really one of the first, it's the beginning of what we know now as like the CIA or any other spy operation.
Much more antiquated, I'm sure, but...
they still use some of those same techniques.
Did they have, like,
invisible
hidden ink and
ink, things like that.
Wow.
Using a code, different codes and code words.
Now,
that
where
sort of thing.
you work, Nicole,
Raynham Hall.
people can learn more about this?
Well, they can learn more about this. There are also, I believe, 3 villages, other sites in Setauket. So it's well documented, and there's several dozen books written about it. There's a couple of books that just have come out in the last 6 months.
Now the revolution ends in '83, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
That's when Cornwallis surrenders to Washington. The British troops then, that was it. They had left before, or they left right then? How long were they around then?
They lingered for probably a week or two, I would say, because of the supplies. It's like leaving Iraq today. You had to get your supplies, in Afghanistan, you're just not going to leave them there to the Americans.
Yes.
So it took a little bit of time. But you said about historic sites, the William Floyd House. I tell you, he's one of the signers of the Declaration. It's a available tour that you can all take.
Is there a paper, a page, something, historical sites of Long Island?
Sure.
I'm sure if you Google that, you can.
Yeah, and
Sure.
someone can
It's
see.
like the Talmadge Trail. If you just go Google Talmadge Trail, they'll give you directions and the map right online. So you can know how to do 21 miles. It takes 2 days.
Wow.
They recommend, because it's crossing a lot of traffic these days. It's not rural Long Island.
Well, and the William Floyd House, just quickly, it's a historic house. So it's, and a lot of these homes are also house museums, which the William Floyd House is. So you can either go through like Long Island Museum Association or things like that. Organizations like that will have a list of all
I mean,
these.
there's a lot of historic houses, and Oyster Bay has got the cream of the
We've
crop
got a couple
there.
of them,
You've
yeah.
got a couple of them. You got the Walt Whitman's house, and East Hills. You got West Hills. You got Cedarmere. Used to be up in Rosslyn. But there are a lot of hidden gems, and unfortunately, it's not
Absolutely.
advertised too well. But it's out there.
That's what I said in the beginning. I think everybody has to do a better job.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward a little bit.
Okay.
The Revolution, let's go into the Civil War for a while. I mean, that's
Right.
many years after. In my recollection, African Americans were pretty prominent in the Civil War in Long Island.
That's true.
Is that true?
We were just recently at the Historical Society privy to some early documentation about the 26th Colored Regiment. Actually, I believe it's the Regiment of United States Colored Troops is actually how it would, how they're known. And the volunteers, they came on, they were recruited and actually, I believe there were several different regiments because it was such a popular a thing for these gentlemen to come and join in the fight against slavery and the southern states. So it was very popular and unusually, I feel like it was unusual that Long Island seemed to garner this massive volunteers. So it is very interesting that the Civil War did reach into Long Island, if not.
But
in that sense.
I remember, and in my Civil War history, it was fascinating stuff. Anybody who's never gone to Gettysburg is missing something, moving, and it's just, it's amazing. But I remember New York City, they had draft riots in
Oh, well, that-
'63.
right.
Did these riots ever come here? What
No,
was Long Island's history
it didn't
like?
involve Long Island. Don't forget, Long Island is a rural area. In fact, I checked the quote to back you up on that with Terry Hunt, who wrote several books on Civil War history of Long Island, and there were documented 300 to 400 African Americans that joined up in the Union, and some actually went to Massachusetts on the famous 54th. Actually, and if you go to Long Island in these rural cemeteries, you'll actually see Civil War soldiers, African American, that are buried here, that came back. And as I say, we had at least 4. Don't forget, there was a lot of free blacks, you know, in Long Island at that time, because New York State got rid of slavery in 1826, I think.
Oh, we
it
did,
was.
okay.
Yeah, so it was like 30 years before or whatever. So therefore, you didn't have slaves in Long Island at that time. You know, you had people had a force to work for people, but not under those conditions of the South.
Was there any record at all, Bob? I don't know this. Maybe you do. Any record of all of Lincoln ever coming to Long Island, or anybody?
Lincoln, I don't.
think
I know
so.
Washington made his tour in 1790.
Slept here like everywhere else. I guess.
Yeah.
That's true.
But Lincoln, New York City, yes, because William Cullen Bryant introduced him at Cooper Union in 1861 when he first ran for president. So a Long Islander actually introduced Lincoln and promoted his presidency, and that's how he won New York State.
In a famous historical hall, yes. Yes. Okay.
You know, something really quick though that was interesting is a document that we found showed a absentee ballot for to vote for president, and we were actually able to find that there was an African American who was serving. So as a member of the Union Army, he was able to. This African American was able to vote when he was normally wouldn't have been able to vote. So it's kind of an interesting thing. There's sort of a
And the females didn't have the vote either.
1920, unbelievable.
Yeah.
So is there a record during the Civil War of African Americans or Black Americans living in pockets of Long Island? Were there certain areas?
Oh yes, definitely. Well, they intermarried with the what was left over from our Indian population from the 13 original, not tribes but communities. I'll put it that way, because it wasn't united into one group. But they did work as up to the 1880s. They were famous for whaling. They actually in Sag Harbor were part of the whaling expeditions. The African Americans, along with the Indians.
Right.
They were very good whalers, and so they had occupations like that. And there were pockets in Sag Harbor, I think Huntington, Oyster Bay.
Definitely Oyster Bay.
Yeah. So any large, well at that time
it's
urban area,
community,
they also lived, and they also worked for the farmers too. Yeah.
Right. There's all sorts of, actually still, even in those early years, it was very sort of an international place. You had your Native Americans, you had African Americans, you had folks coming in from all over Europe. So it was actually much more of an international place than we think.
All right, so Civil War still no Nassau County. Now let's fast forward again, get to the women's suffrage. Now I read, maybe the audience could see this. There was a article in Newsday recently about the women supporting the suffragist cause, and it mentions many books and articles. An author, Antonio Petrache, I hope I spelled it right. She wrote a book on the women's suffrage movement and others, and she mentioned Long Islanders who are active. And you talk about one of the great civil rights movements of history. The women's suffrage movement was indeed that. What Long Island roots do you know during that time? Because it lasted a long time.
Oh,
Right.
lasted from what?
Seneca Falls, 1848.
Well,
Okay, I
after
was going to say
72 years.
1860. Yeah.
Until 1920, when the 19th
they
Amendment
finally get the
was
vote.
passed. Right.
Right.
So you
No,
said there were parades here,
Oh,
and
Roslyn, Huntington, Oyster Bay, Hempstead, which is the big center of town. Hempstead and Jamaica were the big two cities in Long Island, and the western half anyway. And yes, you had suffrage parades in the summer, at Memorial Day, a lot of activity, a lot of writing about it, and sometimes they went to jail because of that. Yeah.
And of course, several affluent women were very much involved, you know, the Roosevelts and whatnot. So it was...
Yes, especially the Roosevelts.
Right,
Yes,
they
yes.
really helped, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, and up to, you know, the 19th Amendment,
That
as you
would
say.
be Franklin or Franklin Roosevelt's or Theodore Roosevelt?
Well, the Franklin Roosevelt's from New Hyde Park, from Hyde
Well,
Park.
Theodore Roosevelt actually wanted women to have the vote.
Right.
So, and so that takes us back to, you know, like 1901 and whatnot. So yeah, you know, these affluent women, you know, they just saw an opportunity to see how, you know, the times were changing, and it was a fantastic opportunity to try and really put forth that effort of women's rights and women's voting. So, you know, they use their affluence, they use their wealth, they use their power in the community to try and change minds.
I read where some of the privileged suffragettes, if I may say that,
sure.
used their money. Many women were arrested, and they would pay their bail or pay their fee, whatever they were fined,
right.
and in return they had to wear a women vote button or something, you know. But they used their influence and to their credit.
Yeah, it's definitely another piece of Long Island history.
It was huge here as long as upstate New York, but New York actually was in the forefront of
Yes.
women's rights.
Yes.
You know, and Long Island was part of that history, you know. Before that, though, we had the Spanish-American War, which involves Camp Mills and Hempstead.
Oh, right.
Well, she mentioned Teddy Roosevelt before. Make that connection now.
Okay,
with,
well, Spanish-American War, as you know, Theodore Roosevelt formed a group called the Rough Riders.
Bob, I hate to interrupt you. Just to inform the audience, where did Theodore Roosevelt live here?
He lived in, well, he was born in New York City.
Right, he was born in the city.
And in your territory, in Oyster Bay.
That's right. He did build Sagamore Hill for he and his first wife, and then, but I think we're getting ahead of our
Okay, whatever.
And then we'll get back to
We
you.
went to the Spanish-American War. Some people said we shouldn't have got into it in the first place, but we did win the war.
Remember the Maine.
And which blew up, and nobody knows how, but we did, in Havana Harbor in Cuba.
Yes.
Roosevelt went down with his group of Rough Riders, mainly from Texas and different parts, and had the famous Battle of San Juan Hill, but I think it was the next hill over anyway.
But it's...
and they came back with all kinds of tropical diseases and problems. So in those days, what they did, they quarantined the whole Rough Riders, and where they put them at? Montauk, okay? Which you actually can go visit now, where
That's
he
true.
was quarantined.
Really?
It's open,
Yes.
it's at State Park. It's Theodore
is.
Roosevelt State Park, I
It
think
is.
it's called.
It's a very nice part.
Wow.
Yeah, it's after the third house on the, they call it, yeah. You know, because
It's way down there.
out there, you know, was the first cattle ranch in the New World, in Montauk.
So he was quarantined, you said?
He and his Rough Riders.
And what
right.
happened, it was so bad at the medical facilities, is that they had to send groups of women that help out from New York City to take the train. We forgot to mention the Long Island Railroad, which is the biggest expansion of Long Island, out to Montauk to help these soldiers out, which really didn't have any medical help at all from the Army. They just planted them there and hoped they'd be cured, you know, and didn't know how to handle it. So Roosevelt was involved in that, as men were. I don't know how many men were involved. Do you have an idea there?
I really don't
Probably
know.
over 100, 150, 200, I would say, you know. And two, they were safe enough to rejoin society, I'll put it that way.
And there are Rough Rider reenactors and groups like that.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Jim
you know,
Foote from Sequoia.
Absolutely, yes.
Jim Foote, I met him,
Yes.
nice guy.
Dresses up as him?
Oh,
and,
he
yeah.
does speeches and
Yeah.
you know, better than, you know, I don't think he calls it impersonator, I guess
Right.
is a name for it, but he does a fantastic job.
Great.
We actually have a guy that does Walt Whitman too.
Wow.
Person, his name is Blaine.
Wow.
Very interesting person. But didn't we have other problem diseases besides the Rough Riders?
Well, that's true. You had mentioned being quarantined, and that brings up Typhoid Mary, who...
Before we get just one
okay.
more, you work at Oyster Bay, right?
I do. I work in Oyster Bay,
So
yes.
how important is Theodore Roosevelt just briefly
yeah.
on a daily on a weekly basis?
Yeah.
How influential is he there?
Well, his life has pretty much touched almost every historic structure in Oyster Bay. from the location, which is unfortunately it's an empty building at the moment, but where they had the first telephone, so that when he needed a message, they ran somebody down to get a telephone message back up to him. To obviously the train station being developed kind of specifically
The summer
because
White
of
House,
his,
they called it.
right, and then there was the building downtown where, well, they did call Sagamore Hill the summer White House
How
because
often
that was his
he there?
residence.
Was he there did he come on the weekends?
It was primarily a summer home until he retired, and then he was there full time. So, but
And he's buried
well, I
there,
shouldn't
right?
really call him retired. Yeah, he's in Young Cemetery, which is just up the road from his home. And it's interesting because I've been to several presidential graves in the country, Mount Vernon and George Washington and whatnot, and Andrew Jackson in Tennessee. But his grave is so modest, and it's really humbling when you think of all the accomplishments of this great man, and the national parks, and so many other incredible things that he had done throughout his presidency, and his lust for life, really. And then here you have this very calm, serene setting right next to an Audubon Center that he is named after him in sort of a tribute to his dedication to nature. So yes, Theodore Roosevelt, his imprint on Oyster Bay it's undeniable, and it's for all time.
Well, thanks for carrying on that tradition. Anything else about Roosevelt before we get to that next topic? Because Roosevelt was related in a way to the typhoid Mary disease in terms, right?
Not really.
Not really, no.
No,
It's a
because
separate,
this was a little later, and other than the fact that it was Mary Mallon did live in Oyster Bay, and that is where she was discovered, and that is when it was discovered by a infectious disease expert that she herself had carried the disease and not the food. For example, I guess let me go back just a minute.
We only got 2 or 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Who was she?
Well, she was a cook, and she was
She
kind
lived on Long Island?
And she lived on Long Island. She took work wherever she could as a cook. She was alone.
Any specific place or jumping around?
We don't really know too much about, or at least I don't, where she was before. But she ended up working for a family who rented a house in Oyster Bay for the summer.
Okay.
And unfortunately, that house is no longer stands. But they were there, and almost everyone in that house had gotten sick over that summer, except for Mary. So the owners of the house had come back after the summer. They hired this expert to come in. He was able to actually narrow down that it was one of the cooks. And then when he followed up on that, he found that wherever Mary Mallon went, typhoid went.
Did she change her name? Because I know she was put
She
away
did
for a
change her
while and
name
came back.
after. Yeah, she had to change her name. But unfortunately, she still disobeyed what everyone needed her to do, which was stop cooking. And so she'd gotten many more people sick even after she'd been discovered and arrested the first time. But it's actually a very sad story because, we just didn't understand as a society how these infectious diseases worked. And so she was treated very poorly, obviously, with the press, forever branded Typhoid Mary. So I do have a lot of sympathy for her.
So she died in quarantine or not?
She did. She died in quarantine.
And I read, and she was, for the time, she lived pretty long. You would think she wouldn't have survived that long.
Right, but she was a carrier, so that the disease never affected her.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking about Roosevelt, just one
Yes.
quick thing. They do have a statue of Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt.
Absolutely.
As you come into Oyster
on the
Bay.
horse.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's very regal looking.
I really hate to end this discussion on such a depressing manner. So if you don't mind, we can continue with this at another time.
That sounds good.
And talk about Long Island history at a later time, maybe World War I or in that range.
Sure.
Fantastic. All right.
It'd be a pleasure.
I want to thank Nicole and Bob very much for an enlightening program, and I hope our audience learned something today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank our guest very much for this terrific discussion. I also want to thank Old Westbury for the beautiful studio, and Sherry Baker, the station manager, who does such a terrific job every day. Again, thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Joe Haynor wishing you a Good night and a better tomorrow.